That was fast. First, quick housekeeping note. I've been asked to ask you all to scoot in towards the middle as much as possible. So if there are any single seats in the middle of your row, if you can scoot into those to make it easier to any latecomer. The last shall be first and all. Well, good evening and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Christopher Scalia. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and it's my honor to introduce you to the fourth installment of our American Dream Lecture Series. A component of AEI's American Dream Initiative, this series seeks to revitalize our nation's core institutions and values by inviting prominent writers, academics, and thinkers to address some of the most significant cultural and social issues facing the United States. As we approach the 200th and 250th anniversary of America's founding, these lectures are an opportunity to ask, how healthy are our national institutions, our foundational principles, and our citizens? What threats do they face, and what prospects for reform are available? In the wide variety and high quality of its featured speakers, the American Dream Lectures continue the tradition of AEI's Bradley Lecture Series, which for decades enriched policy conversations with high-profile lectures about the state of American politics and culture. At the registration table when you entered, you may have seen flyers listing the events we've held so far. I hope you took one to bring home to make a perfect party gift. They list some of the events we've had and events to come. For those of you watching via live stream, on May 7th, we are having Ruth Weiss here to speak about anti-Semitism, followed by a conversation with AEI's Matthew Continetti. So just under a month from today. In 2012, Mark Zuckerberg announced that he hoped Facebook would, quote, rewire the way people spread and consume information, unquote, as well as transform, quote, many of our core institutions and industries. A development that had recently made that hope possible was the rise of the smartphone, which helped us not only check up on our high school frenemies from the palms of our hands, but also surf the internet, watch movies, share pictures, play games, in short, be distracted from the rest of the world around us. For as many conveniences as these new social media platforms and technological products created, they clearly rewired, to use Zuckerberg's word, more than just the spread and consumption of information. In 2008, Nicholas Carr asked, "Is Google making us stupid?" Those were the good old days. By the mid-2010s, it was worth asking, are smartphones and social media making us antisocial? Are they disconnecting us from our families and communities? Are they making us depressed? Are they exacerbating other problems with childhood that had already been generations in the making? Are they pulling us downwards instead of elevating us? What does this mean for the future of our social institutions? And how can a people accustomed to asynchronous virtual experience cohere and participate in public life? To help us consider these and other questions, we are fortunate to have with us today Dr. Jonathan Haidt. Dr. Haidt is the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University's Stern School of Business and the author of such books as The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom, and the New York Times bestsellers The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, and The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting a Generation Up for Failure, co-authored with Greg Lukianoff. And most recently, of course, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. Since 2018, he has been studying the contributions of social media to the decline of teen mental health and the rise of political dysfunction. He's written more than 100 academic articles, which have been cited nearly 100,000 times. In 2019, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he has given 4 TED Talks, and now, even more impressively, He's here for his first American Dream lecture at AEI. In his latest book, The Anxious Generation, Haidt studies how the decline of a play-based childhood beginning in the 1980s, paired with the more recent rise of a cell phone-based childhood, have caused the decline of teen mental health as well as spiritual degradation. He also provides practical suggestions for how families and policymakers can alleviate these problems. Along the way, he offers insights into childhood, human nature, and psychological development that are so radiant it could be dangerous to look directly into them. We are fortunate to have him here today to discuss how some of the phenomena he's tracked have influenced not only our mental health, but our spiritual lives. He will deliver opening remarks on the harms caused by social media and phone-based culture for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then he will be joined on the stage for a discussion with Dr. Christine Rosen, who is a senior fellow here at AEI, focusing on American history, society and culture, technology, and feminism. She is also a columnist for Commentary Magazine and one of the co-hosts of the Commentary Magazine podcast. She's also a fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture and is senior editor in an advisory position at the New Atlantis. She is the author or co-author of many books and book chapters, and this fall she will publish The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World, which investigates the cultural and emotional shifts that accompany our embrace of technology. In other words, she is the ideal interlocutor for Dr. Haidt. They will converse for about 25 minutes, then we'll turn to audience questions. Afterwards, I hope you'll join us for light refreshments and deep conversation in the adjoining gallery. It also looks like there are a few copies of Dr. Haidt's book left. I don't want to stampede, so don't get them now, but after the talk, if you can get a copy, you're welcome to one. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put down your phones and your hands together for Dr. Haidt.
Wow, thank you so much, Chris. That was a really perfect setup. You really covered a lot of the themes that I'm going to be talking about today. So the book came out about 2 weeks ago, and I've been speaking a lot on it, and I've been giving versions of the same talk pretty much everywhere. But today, I decided to do something different because I was reflecting on how my ties to AEI since 2007 through Arthur Brooks have actually influenced me and helped me to get where I am today. And so just very briefly, the story is that I was a professor at the University of Virginia for many years, and during that time, my first book was called The Happiness Hypothesis, and when Arthur Brooks published his book on happiness, he invited me up to AEI, and at the time, I was a sort of a standard partisan Democrat social scientist, and I thought, enemy territory, but okay, he seems like a nice guy. All right, I'll come, I've never really met conservatives before, but how bad could it be? And I came up to the old building, and I was treated really well, and the conversations were great, and I got to know Arthur, and we've really become friends over the years. But that was 2006 or 7, and that's right around when I started working on my book, The Righteous Mind, which is about what is moral psychology, why are we so polarized, why are we so divided by politics and religion, and that began a period of trying to understand conservatives and libertarians so I could write about them honestly in the book. And that really opened my mind, made me stop being a partisan anything. And I think it just made me a better social scientist to just think, like, where are the good ideas? Let's just look for good ideas all over and see what we can do with them. So I have a lot of new materials that I have not shown before here in this 25-minute talk. First, I'll just summarize. I can summarize the whole book in two different ways. The first is, as Chris said, the basic argument is that the play-based childhood, which is what we've had for literally millions of years, because we're mammals and all mammals play when they're young, the play-based childhood faded out gradually in this country between 1980 and 2010, and then all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, the phone-based childhood swept in between 2010 and 2015. That, I think, was what did it. That's what I think pushed Gen Z over the edge, and I'll show you a bit of that in a moment. Another way to say this is that we have overprotected our children in the real world, where they need a huge amount of varied experience. and we have underprotected them online, where there are no protections of any kind for children. But now let me show you an indirect way to get there. So when I began thinking about the righteous mind, I began thinking about I decided to teach a course on political psychology at the University of Virginia in 2004. And I was in New York City at the time, just visiting someone, and I stopped into Strand Bookstore, and I went to the political theory section, and there was a big, thick book that said Conservatism on the Spine. And I just pulled it off. I said, okay, this could be interesting. And I started reading the introduction to the book. And the introduction was so clear and so powerful as a set of ideas that made sense to me as a social scientist that I had to just sit there on the floor and read it. I did buy the book, and I did walk out with it, and I did teach it. But the really fun thing is that Jerry Mueller is actually here in the audience. Wait, Jerry, here's Jerry Mueller, a wonderful intellectual historian. And some of the ideas that got me right away, because I was trying to understand the psychological differences between left and right, and this intro chapter, it gives you sort of an overview of what is conservative thought. He says, while liberals typically view with suspicion the restraints and penalties imposed on the individual by institutions, conservatives are disposed to protect the authority and legitimacy of existing institutions because they believe human society cannot flourish without them. And then he says, the restraints imposed by institutions are necessary to constrain and guide human passions. And there he's, of course, paraphrasing what he says a moment later, which is the famous quote from Edmund Burke, that the restraints on men, as well as their liberties, are to be reckoned among their rights. And so for me, as at the time, roughly 40 or 43-year-old, a political liberal, this was a surprising statement, a provocative statement. And so I was just thinking about that. And then this way of thinking influenced me in writing The Righteous Mind, in which in chapter 8 on why conservatives have an advantage in American politics. They seem to know some things about the moral taste buds and moral buttons of American voters that the Democrats often fail to realize. So I contrasted John Stuart Mill, a society based on the ideas of John Stuart Mill, in which all individuals are equal, all should be left as free as possible to move, develop talents, and form relationships as they please. And that sounded very good to me at the time, and it still sounds very good to me. To the extent that I say I am a liberal, it is in this sense, a John Stuart Mill liberal. But I wanted to contrast that with the vision that I found resonating on the among social conservatives, not so much economic conservatives, but social conservatives, to which I said, I appealed to my favorite social scientist, Emil Durkheim. So I said, now imagine, in contrast to the Millian society, imagine society not as an agreement among individuals, but as something that emerged organically over time as people found ways of living together, binding themselves to each other, suppressing each other's selfishness. So I suggest that Emil Durkheim is sort of an intellectual hero of this way of thinking, because he warned in this magnificent book, Suicide, which I read in graduate school, he warned that man cannot become attached to higher aims and submit to a rule if he sees nothing above him to which he belongs. To free himself from all social pressure is to abandon himself and demoralize himself. So these are the ideas I'm putting up there now, and I'm going to come back to them in about 10 minutes, because I think they really solve a mystery that a puzzle that I'm going to present to you now. So this is the outline of my standard book talk that I've been giving over the last couple of months. I won't have time to give most of it, but what I want to do is show you where there's a gap. I need a section 3.5 on the weakening of communities and institutions. As you see, my theory is this two-part theory: loss of the play-based childhood, rise of the phone-based childhood. And that's the way I wrote the book. But even in the book, there are some things where I begin getting into this sort of Durkheimian binding stuff, and now I'm realizing that might well be a third equally important feature of what happened to all of us, with devastating effects on young people. So let me explain this. I'm going to show you now what has happened to Americans born after 1995. Raise your hand if you are one of those. If you are Gen Z, born after 1995. Oh, wow. Okay, great. So keep me honest. Please, at the end, I'm going to ask you for a vote. And And if you have, we'll have time for questions, especially if you have objections. If you think I got something wrong, please tell me, because that's how I can get better. So here is just basic stats. This is representative data from American colleges, representative of the college student population. In 2012, all the college students just about were millennials, and as Gen Z comes in, a number of things start going up, but it's really psychological disorders that go up the most. The difference between Gen Z and the millennials is largely that Gen Z has much higher rates of anxiety, depression, and several other related disorders. Now, we can see this from a different data set. We can see that the increase was especially in anxiety and depression. What I'm going to show you here is that in all these graphs, if you stop your data collection in 2010, you see nothing. There's no trend in the 10 years before that. But as soon as you go past 2010, this is what happens. So it's especially, so college students, again, in 2012 they were millennials, but as the college students become Gen Z, rates of anxiety and depression go way, way up. Now it's just Gen Z. So here's the different age groups. There used to be a small difference among age groups. But as we go on in the 2010s, it's not older people aren't changing. It's not like the world is getting so terrible, everyone is depressed and anxious. It's really Gen Z and some late millennials that are being hit by this. And it is gendered. So these are the rates of major depression in the last year, girls and women on the top. And what we see is, now the boys, to be clear, the boys are also getting more depressed and anxious. They're starting from much lower rates, so the rise isn't as dramatic. But relatively speaking, they're also getting more than 1.5 times more depressed. But there's an interesting feature of this graph, because the 2022 data just came in about 2 or 3 months ago, and so I added it to the graph. What you see is that COVID actually didn't do much. That is, the depression and anxiety was all baked in by 2019. And then it just kept going up. And it went up a little faster during COVID, comes down, but basically the trend line was unaffected, really, by COVID. And some people have challenged me saying, oh, this is just, changing diagnostic criteria. Is Sally Sattel here? Is Sally here? Oh, she must be off watching the eclipse. Sally is a wonderful psychiatrist who read the book and gave me amazing comments on the book. In any case, she's been concerned about sort of concept creep and lowering definitions of addiction and all kinds of terms. And that certainly has happened. And so some people have said, oh, the kids are all right. This is a moral panic. Height is spreading moral panic. It's just that young people are more likely to admit it, and that's a good thing. If that was true, then it wouldn't show up in behavior. It would only show up in self-report. But when we look at, this is actually not hospital admissions. This is technically emergency room visits. So teens taken to emergency rooms for non-fatal self-harm. Now this is the younger teens. This is where you see by far the most dramatic increases. Here's what happens. So the girls are up 188%. 10 to 14-year-old girls didn't used to cut themselves in this country, but now it's much more common. They cut themselves now at the rate that older teen girls used to 20 years ago. And we see the same thing for suicide. Once again, 10 to 14-year-olds have very low suicide rates, but once we go through this period, they go way, way up, with an astonishing 67% increase in a single year between 2012 and 2013, as if something happened in 2012. And it's not just us. We see exactly the same pattern all over the Anglosphere. Here's self-harm hospitalizations or from medical records in the UK. Here's Canadian data. Now this is different. This is those who said their mental health is excellent or very good, so high is good. And what you see is that the youngest women used to be the happiest. This is actually a fairly universal pattern. It's called the U-shaped curve of happiness. The happiest people have always been those who are young adults, like in their late teens and early 20s, and people in the 60s and 70s. They're the happiest people. People in their 40s, 50s, and 60s have all the burdens of life. They are less happy. And this was true until about 10 years ago all over the world. I just got a paper from, I forget his first name, Blanchflower, who's been studying this. He just sent me the paper yesterday, showing that in 27 countries, the U-shaped curve is over, because young people are now the least happy all over the world. And now I want to bring in a really interesting twist on the data that is going to really be it'll link up with what I was telling you before. So it turns out that it's not hitting liberal and conservatives the same way. So these are some researchers who took the Monitoring the Future study. There are 4 questions on it about that like sometimes I think I'm no good at all, or my life has no purpose. So they're really questions about despair. And what we see here is that there's a very small difference between liberals and conservatives up until 2010. This has long been known and discussed and debated, that conservatives are a little happier than liberals. In fact, that was one of the points of Arthur's book on happiness. It was Gross National Happiness, I think that was the title. So that was one of Arthur's points, is that this finding that liberals are a little bit more neurotic, a little bit more creative, a little bit less conscientious. So there's some well-known personality differences that, when you walk into a room, like just by looking at you, I know that this is not a left-wing group because, most men are wearing jackets and all sorts of things that just wouldn't happen if it was a progressive organization. So these things have long been known, but the differences have usually been pretty small until 2010. Here's what happens. So everyone is up, but the liberal boys and girls go up first, and the liberal girls in particular go up first and fastest. So this is data from the Monitoring the Future study, but there are several other data sets that show the exact same thing. This is Pew. So they have this panel survey that they do repeatedly, and one was scheduled. They happened to do it in April of 2020. So this is like just as we're all afraid of COVID, we're all concerned. And the question was, has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you that you have a mental health condition? And what you can see here is a two-way interaction. You can see that women, on average, are more likely to say yes than men. That's long been known. Women are more subject to depression and anxiety in particular. And you can see that there's an age gradient, that young people are more likely to have been told they have a mental health condition than elderly people, even though they've been alive much longer. There's just much more diagnosis in more recent decades. So that's you see two factors there that matter. But when we bring in the data for liberals, it's very different. We see a three-way interaction. We see that liberals at all points, not the older liberals, but the younger liberals are more likely to say yes than moderates or conservatives. We see that the male-female difference is larger among liberals. And we see that for young women, this is just limited to young white women who say they're on the left, the majority of them said that they've been told they have a mental health condition. So something is going on that really affected girls on the left after 2010. The differences between liberal and conservative before 2010 were small. So why is this happening at the same time, right around 2012, 2013, in many countries, with the biggest impacts on young girls and on liberals? What's going on? I believe that my book offers the only theory that can explain it. People tell me, this must have been the global financial crisis in 2008, which didn't do anything for 4 years, and then it hit the young girls hardest in every country, even Canada, where they didn't really have much. So it just doesn't make any sense. There is no alternative that works around the world. I think that this is the theory that explains it, especially if I add the third factor that I'm presenting to you today, the weakening of communities and institutions. Now, let me just show you, just very briefly, points 2 and 3, just to illustrate them. This is a really easy and fun way to illustrate how quickly childhood has changed. So I want you to all think about the age at which you were given freedom. You could walk out the door, say goodbye to your parents, you're off someplace with your friends, you're on your bicycle, you walk to a friend's house, no adult supervision. If that was you in first grade, your number is 6. If that wasn't true until 7th grade, your number is 12. All right? So everyone look at that, pick the number, the age at which you were let out. Okay? So now, first, only raise your hand if you were born before, let's say, 1984. Raise your hand if you're before born. Okay. So you're all Gen X, some older millennials, and some baby boomers like me. So just you, I'm going to, as I sweep my finger around the room, just yell out your number. Just the older people, okay? Yell it out.
8.
8.
Okay. So 6 to 8. If you weren't out by 4th grade, like something was weird about your family, and like someone's going to call the police. Like, what are they doing to that kid? He can't come out to play? So it's 1st to 3rd. Like by 3rd grade, everyone's out. Okay, now let's do Gen Z. And also, parents, raise your hand if you are a parent of a Gen Z. Raise your hand if you have Gen Z kids. Okay, if I invite you, no, actually no, I'll come to you next. Think about the age for your kid. Okay, so just real Gen Z folks. Get ready to yell at your number as I point to you. Just yell it out.
12, 8,
12,
10, 14, 10, 8, 11, 12.
So you see, so this is what I always find. And look at the difference. So those of us who grew up during the crime wave, when there were drunk drivers, and some of them were us, that's just what we did. Life was actually kind of dangerous, but everyone went out. It was just normal. And then in the 90s, crime plummets for reasons that sociologists are unsure of, although I'm pretty sure, I think it's because of we eliminated leaded gas, and all over the world, when you eliminate leaded gas, 18 years later, 15 years later, the crime rate plummets. That's another story. In any case, the point is, by the 90s, life gets really, really safe. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, we've locked up the drunk drivers, gets really, really safe, and we decide, you know what? It's too dangerous to let our kids out. We're not going to let our kids out. They'll be abducted, you know, they'll be hit by a car. It's terrible. We can't let our kids out. Okay, so that's just to show you just how radically childhood has changed. We locked up our kids. We do not give them freedom. And it's especially sad, you know, here we are thinking about American institutions. You know, the American experiment is an experiment in self-governance. Can we govern ourselves without a king? That's the big question. And kids learn to be self-governing on the playground. They learn to be self-governing by having teams and games and conflicts and adjudication of those conflicts. That's how you learn the skills of democracy. And we decided in the 90s, no more of that. We are not going to let young people learn the skills of democracy. We're going to just protect them all the time. So that was bad enough, but strangely, the rates of mental illness didn't really rise with the millennials. So the millennials is when we begin the overprotection, but their mental health is actually pretty good. They don't get more depressed and anxious. But as Ross Douthat pointed out, in a way we were sort of weakening young people, and then when the iPhone comes in, the phone-based childhood comes in, that's when all hell breaks loose. So I didn't realize this until I got well into the book, that there were two very discrete waves of technology. The first one, this is the share of US households that have adopted things. So the PC was coming in the 80s, but you couldn't do that much with it. And then internet comes in, but it's very slow, and you put your phone on a thing and it makes a noise, and it's very slow. But it was kind of interesting. So that first wave, that affected the millennials, because a lot of millennials got on AOL and things like that. They remember that from the 90s. And that was great. The early internet was amazing. And many of us thought, we're getting godlike powers. This is incredible. And then we go into the 21st century, and all these apps, all these programs are coming out. So the first wave was amazing. It's the second wave, though, that was so different. This is social media, which begins around 2003, 2004 with MySpace and Facebook. And then when you pair it with the smartphone, now all of a sudden, you have young people who, they don't just go home and sit at their parents' computer to go on AOL. They have the entire internet in their pocket all the time, even when they're on the school bus, even when they're in the lunchroom, even when they're trying to go to bed. They have the internet in their hand all the time. And so this is what caused what I'm calling the great rewiring of childhood. Kids used to be, the Little Rascals, I used to watch that when I was a kid with my sisters. And in the bottom left, you see an image of what life was like even up into the 80s, where you could just put an extraterrestrial in a basket and ride around town. It's just, it was just a thing that was perfectly normal. And this is what it's become. If you're a boy, you can't go to your friend's house, because then you can't play video games. You have to go home alone to your house, so you can put on your headset and have your controller, and then you can play these amazing multiplayer video games with your friends. You have to be alone. And if you're a girl, you're spending all your time checking what's going on social media and posting and liking and wondering why someone didn't like yours. And so this is what childhood has become, solitary. We can see this in another data set. This is the average amount of time that Americans spend with their friends outside of work and school. And obviously, the 15 to 24-year-olds are spending a lot of time with friends because they're not married, they don't have jobs for the most part. So yeah, they're spending a lot of time with friends. Whereas older people, I see my friends now and then, but I'm busy. Until we get into the 2010s, and then look what happens. So time with friends plummets. It plummets for young people only, not for older people at all. And look at this. The 2019 data point was collected before COVID, and the 2020 data point was collected during the early time of COVID lockdowns. Do you see the effect of COVID in that graph? No, you don't, because it was just a continuation of what was going on before. Gen Z was already socially distanced by the time we got to 2019. They only had a little bit further to go to complete the project in 2020. And even when they're together, they're not really together. So those numbers grossly overestimate the degree to which they're actually looking at each other or interacting. So that's my general story about what happened to teen mental health for those born after 1995, why it happened, and how it was these two factors. Okay, so now we come back to the mystery and the things I laid out in the beginning. Why is it hitting liberals more than conservatives? This was just in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago, a really interesting article on how Israel is actually one of the happiest countries on earth. That's even true today, even in the midst of the war. Because Israel has very unique sociology. Israel is right up there with the Nordic countries that we always hear about as being so happy. And this Israeli was talking about how Israelis have such intense, many of them have intense religion, but of course much of Israel is secular. But even there, with their military service, their sense of national identity, the external threat, the shared culture, there's a lot of things going on that actually make Israelis very happy people. Their teens are much happier than our teens are. So let's look into the role of religion. I'm sure many of the scholars here at AI have been looking into this. So this has long been known that church-going or religious services is going down. Not that much of a drop in the 20th century, but it speeds up as the internet comes in. People get busy. There's all sorts of other things. So it drops, and it drops even faster in the 2010s. But look at where it's dropping. So now this is the Monitoring the Future studies. These are high school seniors. Kids who say that they are conservative on a 5-point scale, kids who say they're conservative, they're not saying religion is getting less important in their families. The big change has been that if you're a liberal, you used to maybe go to church or synagogue, and in the 2010s you probably don't. It's been dropping for a long time. Actually, it's been dropping since the 70s, as you can see. But it drops even faster in this 5-year period that I call the Great Rewiring. And now when we break it up by liberal, conservative, and male-female, what we see is that once again, it's the liberals who are not going to services, whereas the conservatives aren't changing very much over 50 years, really. And now when we bring in these questions on the Monitoring the Future, these really sad questions, like sometimes I think I am no good at all. How much do you agree with that on a 1 to 5 scale? Or I feel that my life is not very useful. Strongly agree, mildly agree. And so what you find when you make a scale out of these four items, what you find is that kids who say, high school seniors who say that they are conservative rather than liberal, and that religion is important to them or their family, I can't remember the wording, but religion is very important to them, they're only up a little bit. I mean, they are up, you can see, but they don't even go up until 2016, whereas the other groups, including conservatives who are not religious, those groups go up much faster and higher. And so, oh, by the way, that was, okay, this was data just for males, okay? Because you always want to look at the two sexes differently, separately. The split for girls is even bigger. The conservative religious girls are not really up very much at all. All the other 3 groups, especially secular liberals, are way up in this sense of languishing. And if you look even, certainly back in the 90s, there was no difference between the groups. So it only opens out in the 2000s, and it really spreads in the 2010s. Okay, so that's what we see when we look within the United States. We see that being religious or being conservative, which in my analysis, social conservatives have more binding moral communities, less individualism, or I should just say, more sense of duty and responsibility to the family, country, those sorts of things. where I'm especially getting even more interested in this is new data that Zach Rausch and I are so Zach Rausch is this really brilliant young man who I hired in 2020 to help me just as a general research assistant, but he's done such an amazing job going through all these giant data sets and drawing out the lessons. And so this is Zach's post. He's the one he found what happened in the Anglosphere and everywhere. This is a recent post where we're looking at Europe, because Europe is complicated. The Nordic countries are just like the Anglo countries, but the rest of Europe is more complicated. Overall, we do see an increase in psychological distress in Europe, for girls especially, not as dramatic for boys. But when Zach dug into it, here's what he found. When we break up the countries, there's I think 32 countries in this data set. When we break it up by the countries that are high individualism based on, I forget which system, they're the countries listed in yellow there. When we break it up in that way, what we see is that by far the biggest rise is for girls in individualistic countries. They're the ones who are washed away when everything moved online. So we broke it up by individualism, and if we divide the countries by religiosity, we see the same story. So here it's a slightly different group. Most of the countries are different. What we do is we take the top third versus the bottom third on this dimension. So the top third religious countries versus the bottom third religious countries. And we see the same pattern, that by far the largest percentage increases are, in this case, it's the low religiosity girls. They're the ones who were swept away in Europe. So again, something is going on such that young people and people in individualistic countries like the Anglos and the Nordics used to actually be the happiest. Or I'm sorry, not liberal, but individualistic countries actually are the ones that dominate the lists of happiness. They used to be the happiest. But it's in those happy individualistic secular countries that we see that by far the greatest decline, especially in secular liberals and girls. And so I get at this just a little bit as I was finishing writing the book. I put in some things about this third component. I give this quote from Durkheim in chapter 7 of the book. If this binding social order dissolves, if we no longer feel it in existence, then whatever is social in us is deprived of all objective foundation. All that remains is an artificial combination of illusory images, a phantasmagoria vanishing at the least reflection, nothing which can be a goal for our action. And that, to me, sounds like a pretty good description of life online. Just stuff, just trivia, ephemera, coming at you 1,000 times faster than it ever could have before. And so I conclude chapter 7 by saying that, I believe, is what happened to Gen Z. They're less able than any generation in history to put down roots in real-world communities populated by known individuals who will still be there a year later. So I've become really interested in the ideas, especially of Yuval Levin and David Brooks, two brilliant thinkers that I've read and known for many years. They've been talking, especially in recent years, well, Yuval always, but and David always too. They both have really understood the importance of moral formation, constraint, training, mentorship. And then putting those two reminded me that we also have to really give a strong nod of approval to James Hunter, who was really on this case back in the 90s, that you have to have a rich, thick moral matrix within which young people develop. If you don't, you get very bad results. So that, I think, brings us back to that dictum from Burke that I didn't really understand that well when I first read it, but I think it makes a lot more sense now. And so that's my presentation. That's just it's some new stuff. It's the beginning of a discussion. Let's talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I'm sure all of you have been following. He's very modest. He's the #1 New York Times best-selling book this week. So if you cannot get the book here, I encourage you to get it online. And I also know for a fact that his publisher didn't print enough copies of the book. So they'll get a Kindle, or well, actually, I would not argue for a Kindle, but you can get a print copy and read it slowly away from a screen. I'm very glad that you started talking about communities, and I would encourage all of you to take very seriously this idea of 2 waves of technological change. The first wave, the internet, you said was amazing, brought all these new things, really good for us. I would push back a little on that, and I think there were people at the time who raised concerns, largely community-based concerns, saying, is going on a website where, is Facebook the same thing as, meeting up with your friends?
That's the second wave.
Okay, even email is communicating via email, listservs, which were very popular, very useful if you're in academia as well. But in general, if we agree that there were some good, some bad, there was still nevertheless no reckoning with what we were giving up at the time. And we all just kind of assumed, you know what, everything that's bad, we'll work it all out. We'll work the kinks out. Recall a book, particularly about gaming, called Everything Bad is Good for You. Do you remember this book, Stephen Johnson? It was basically like, stop having a moral panic about how the internet and video gaming it's actually good for you. So that was sort of the tone, very optimistic, forward-looking. And then social media came. So my first question for you, because you're here among conservatives, where do we start to place responsibility here? And my first part is tech companies, technology companies. Yeah. What is your response to companies that deliberately designed platforms that particularly targeted children and particularly targeted addictive behavior?
So let me start that by, rather than, you can certainly guess what I'm going to say about the tech companies, but let me actually put a bigger frame around it, which is that to some degree this was inevitable. What I mean is, I think our species is kind of like Icarus, like we're going to fly too close to the sun no matter what, you can't stop us, and then our wings are going to melt, we're going to crash to Earth. So if social media, if Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg hadn't worked out the particular advertising-based business model, which is the worst part of this and which is, I think, linked to a lot of the problems, if they had never existed, if they had not created Facebook, things would not be quite as bad, but we'd be still going in the same direction. So to some degree, this is the inevitable fruit of modernity, technology, connecting us to the world, which means we don't care very much about who's around us. If you can find the best, musician or whatever in the world, you don't need to employ your local musician. It's probably not as good on average as the best in the world. So to some extent, the decline of community was baked in as soon as we started the Industrial Revolution. And then I think the question is, how do we adapt to it? And I think you could make the case that in the 20th century, we actually did develop some ways of adapting, and then liberals and conservatives would disagree as to whether those were adequate. The conservatives were always sounding the alarms. So that's the first thing. The big picture, this had to happen, although I don't think it had to happen this bad. Now, onto the tech companies. So we say tech companies, and there are so many of them, and many of them have made our lives better. It's really only a few that are their business model requires them to hook children as many and as deeply as possible, because if they don't hook them, someone else will spearfish them. So they all know exactly how old their users are. They know everything about them. They could kick off their underage. You're supposed to be 13 to open an account according to federal law, but they don't kick anyone off. And we also know from internal whistleblower accounts that Meta is probably the worst of them. There are just so many. Yeah, there's so many whistleblowers from Meta. Arturo Bejar was the most recent one. We'll be publishing some of his writing on my Substack on After Babel in the next couple of weeks. So I think Meta, because it's the biggest, and Instagram is the one that's most closely linked to mental illness in girls. TikTok, I think, is probably even worse ultimately, but it's so new we don't yet have a lot of data on that. So yeah, I'd say Meta and TikTok in particular. Snapchat, I'm learning more about. I think they have some problems too. Although I don't believe, I think TikTok and Meta are really the ones that bear a huge amount of blame.
Yes. So what role is there? You're here among people who care about free enterprise, who are skeptical of federal top-down regulation. You have some solutions that you offer in your book, and actually most of them are not regulatory. Most of them are about collective action, about parental responsibility and the like, which conservatives love to hear. But is there a place, because of the level of harm that you have shown us these platforms encourage, particularly with children, what role is there for both federal legislation and state-level legislation? Because as you say in your book, there's a lot of interesting bipartisan effort right now going on in that arena.
Yeah, so to be clear, what I'm proposing here is that we're stuck in a set of collective action problems. The reason why parents give their their sixth grader a smartphone is because she says everyone else has one, I'm left out. So if any of us does the right thing alone, we're putting our kid at a disadvantage. But if we all do it together, or if even half of us do it together, then it actually becomes much easier. So collective action problems, 3 of which require no regulation, no government. So the first is no smartphones before high school. Let's just clear it out of the lives of middle schoolers. This is not a law. I would not favor a law saying a 13-year-old can't own it, but a norm. Just give them a flip phone or a phone watch. Those work great. That's what the millennials had, and they were fine. So no smartphone before high school. I'll skip. Okay, the second one is no social media until 16. That's one that we can do as a norm, but it'll be hard, and it would really help to have government support. So we'll come back to that one. The third is phone-free schools, which schools can do themselves, and of course all of that is state level, and a lot of governors are now looking into it because this is the easiest, most powerful. We can do it this year. It'll have huge effects. It always has a big effect. Every school that does it loves it. So all schools have to go phone-free this year. We don't need government help for that, although Jeb Bush brought me in to speak to his group of education people, and in talking with state legislators, it was clear, you know what, if they would just put up a few $1 million to defray the cost of phone lockers, like a lot of schools are dissuaded because they don't have the money for the phone lockers. So that one requires nothing. And then the fourth norm is far more free play, independence, and responsibility in the real world. This is work I'm doing with Lenore Skenazy, who wrote Free Range Kids. We started an organization called Let Grow. So some regulation would be helpful, but it's not essential. We have to basically give kids back childhood. The big sticking point seems to be the second one, because I do think that the current age of 13 is too low and it's not enforced. The biggest single thing we could do to turn this whole mental health crisis around, the biggest single thing we could do is to raise the age from 13 to 16 and mandate enforcement, hold the companies responsible, not for perfection, but for making a good faith effort to really keep people off until 16. Let me ask this audience a question. If you had to say, here are your 3 choices, which category are you in? Would you say you are a social conservative? Would you say you're a libertarian? Or would you say you are a progressive? Just those 3. Let me just get a sense of the room. Raise your hand if you'd say you are a social conservative. Raise your hand high. Okay, a lot of you. Raise your hand if you'd say you're a libertarian. Okay, not that many. And raise your hand if you'd say you're a progressive. Okay, about the same as libertarians. Wow, what's going on?
We're a big tent here today.
Okay. So as long as there's very few libertarians here, I can kind of we can all plan together because, and I'm joking, but the
you won't be allowed to defend yourself during Q&A.
But a really interesting thing has developed that I've never seen before. Everything has always been left versus right, and this is not. The left and the right are actually in total agreement. It's the libertarians who are opposed, because libertarians think John Haidt wants to regulate social media, therefore he's bad and he's wrong, and everything says is wrong. Oh, and by the way, there's not even a crisis. That's what they say. So it's called solution aversion. There's research showing if you don't like the solution, you deny that there's even a problem. So I do think, I love libertarians. I have a lot of libertarian friends. I like a lot of libertarian ideas. But on this one, an extremism in defense of unregulated markets, which real libertarians wouldn't do. So if you look at what, I teach a course on professional responsibility. We want efficient markets. We don't want market failures. We don't want monopoly, which some of the companies sort of have. We don't want asymmetric information, which of course all the companies have. We don't want imposing costly externalities on people who are not part of the transaction, which all the companies do. And we don't want the exploitation of public goods, such as the entire attention span of everyone. How about if we not let companies just take all of it? So, what we have is, I think, the most inefficient, corrupt market in the most important area of life, which is our ability to think, talk, communicate, and live. So, libertarians, if you're listening, either here or there, I love you, but could you at least, can we compromise on maybe protecting children? That's really all I'm asking.
It is striking to realize that there are states in which you cannot get a tattoo until you're 18, but you can have an Instagram or other social media account when you're 7 or 8 years old. Well, this brings me to, there's one group in your book and one line or two where you acknowledge, I don't know what the answer is, which concerned me because I'm always looking to you for the answer to these problems, and it worried me. But it's a challenge all of us as parents who have kids have faced. And this is the question of the digital umbilical cord, I think is how you put it. The fact that it's not just that the kids love this stuff and get hooked on it and live their social lives online, it's that the parents like to track and survey their kids because that reassures the parents. So to that, this is a question where I think the conservative community-based orientation, family or religious community-based orientation does have very clear answers. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little on that concern, particularly the surveillance aspect, because one of the reasons kids are anxious is that they're always being watched.
So, I think I think the primary cause of the anxiety is not that they're being watched by their parents. It's all the other stuff going on in their social world. Right. But the parents constantly checking on them means they never actually get to taste true independence, true freedom, where you're responsible for yourself. They can always call their parents, and there was just an article, I think it was in Slate, on how hard it is to be a middle school teacher because your kids are always communicating with their parents. Like during class, they're texting their parents, and the parents are checking in and making requests and demands. So the parents are a big part of the problem. The thing that I say that I don't know in the book is Lenore Skenazy and I have debated this for years. Lenore says we shouldn't track our kids. Just give them a phone, like a flip phone, let them out in the world, trust them, don't track them. My argument is I was willing to follow your advice, Lenore, much earlier in New York City than I would have because I could see that my son had made it to school. I could see where he was. So to the extent that it lets you give your kids more freedom, I think it could be a net positive. I think maybe the way to resolve this is a lot of people use tracking programs like Life 360, which is like as Orwellian a name as you can get. And my family, we do use Find My, because like we want to know, like, okay, he has track meet. Is he on his way home? When will he be home for dinner? So we find that very useful, and we're not always watching it. Someone showed me their Life 360. It's not just where is he, it's he was here for 17 minutes, and then he went here for 25 minutes. You can see everything they did all day long. That, I think, is a creepy level of surveillance. So I think the key thing is give your kids a lot of independence, and if you do that, then it's okay to do a little bit of tracking, I think.
Okay.
What do you think?
I
do you have kids?
I have twin 17-year-old boys,
okay.
But they had no screen 0 to 5, no smartphone until high school.
Oh, good.
They were the last kids to get, and believe me, they will tell you about it if you ask.
But do they still resent you for it, or do they think you did the right thing?
They're starting to come out of resentment and into perhaps, generally positive acceptance. But I chose not to track them, and they're city kids like your kids. They rode the bus to school, public transportation to get to and from school. And it is nerve-wracking because when you know, as a parent, that you can track your kids and you think, oh, safety, 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 you want to do it. So I chose not to. I have friends who chose to, in part because they had one kid who would just hand his phone with the tracker on it to another friend and then go do his own thing in a very, as a Gen Xer, I admired that impulse, but his parents did not. Yeah. So no, I think that's one of those individual choices where I think communities discussing it, which thanks to your book they will be, can help people come to some group solutions. I want to leave time for questions, but I have one more question. I'm going to quote. I was pleased to see that you quoted Marcus Aurelius in your book, and this was the quote: the things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts. And I was like, I know you a little bit. I was like, an atheist talking about the soul. And you do have a section of the book that I think is very persuasive, which talks about spiritual practices, for lack of a better term. So my question is, looking at the data about religious communities and how some of the children in those communities are protected from some of these more negative influences, is that translatable to a, for lack of a better phrase, spiritual but not religious world, an increasingly secular world? Because the thing that religious community does is not just create boundaries and protections, but enforce rules. So what do you think in terms of the secular version of that?
That's a great question. So just very, very briefly, after I'd written 7 chapters on what happened to kids, and I was really late on turning the book in, but I felt like I had to say something about what it's doing to adults. And I just started making a list of all the things it's doing to all of us, fragmenting our attention, filling us with stuff. We can never get a moment of quiet. So I made a list of all the things happening, and I realized, oh wow, this brings me back to my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, and a lot of the wisdom of religious traditions and also the Stoic tradition, so a lot of philosophical traditions. And they all had similar insights. One of them is, as the Marcus Aurelius quote, Buddhist said something like, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. We take on the color of what we think about." And if you've ever seen what kids are watching on TikTok, especially the boys, a lot of it is people getting hit by cars, punched in the face, not falling down stairs. I mean, it's horrible stuff. And then it's hours and hours of this, and it's just so degrading. And if we spend hours, we feel dirty afterwards. And our brains were formed before this. So imagine kids going through puberty, their neurons are wiring up, and this is what's coming in. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's the background. So chapter 8, if you don't have kids, if you don't care about kids at all, buy the book to read chapter 8, because that's the one on spiritual elevation and degradation. Okay, now, to your question, it's long been thought, there have long been movements, like, can't we have all the good things about religion just without all the God stuff? Right. And there's like Sunday Assembly from the UK. There's efforts to bring people together without the God stuff. And I would imagine those things are definitely better than nothing, because if you have rituals, if you have a group. But as far as I can tell, and what we see in the data on happiness and religion, progressive denominations are not very binding, and they don't seem to confer the same mental health benefits. I think they are still beneficial, but not as much. And this, again, was Durkheim's point. Durkheim was not a conservative, although he's read by conservatives a lot, is that we actually need, perfect freedom is really, really bad for us. We need constraints, we need restrictions, we need duties to others, and if we don't have them, then it's all about me all the time. The phones have allowed young people to have pretty much everything they want, whenever they want, for free with no effort. If you're a boy, why bother talking to a girl and being embarrassed? You can have amazing sex with, your virtual girlfriend. You can design however you want. And this is before they're put into robots. The robotics progress is so fast. In a couple of years, they're going to have, physical, three-dimensional robot girlfriends. They're just not going to develop the skills of talking to girls and women. So. I'm sorry, this is far afield from your question. It's just something that really bothers me. But so I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, and in the spirit of Durkheim, let's keep the anomie to a minimum in your questions. But we have microphones, so if you'll raise your hand and wait until the microphone comes to you. Let's see. We have one here up front. They're bringing your mic.
Hi, thank you. Wonderful talk. And I'm a boomer, and I actually walked to school at first grade, which is 20 minutes away, so it was different. What I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned, of course, Mr. Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. And Sheryl, of course, is referred to in some books as typhoid Sheryl, because she took that model, that addictive advertising model, to Google and other places, and from there. What do you think we can do about these algorithms? It is an addiction. It is a promotion of an addiction, just like fentanyl, just, like other addictions, where they're using algorithms that promote impulse buying techniques like FOMA, fear of missing out, among the most vulnerable teenage girls. Where they are constantly presented deliberately with a never reachable goal of looking a certain way, etc., for the purpose of selling them cosmetics, clothing, music, etc. But they have now a constant anxiety, and that is deliberate. It is built into the algorithms, which then push the technology. So can't we control that, even though it's an enigma how it works to a normal person?
Yes. So
thank you.
So I think it's important to make a huge, bright line between adults and children. And especially, in Europe, they can do all sorts of things. But in America, we're not going to make a law saying that, adults can't choose what services or what companies to associate with. But I'll be damned if I'm going to let companies approach my children without my knowledge or consent and do things to them like this in ways that I can't even stop unless I literally lock them in a room away from the internet. So this is why I do think that we do need regulation, the most important thing is to simply raise the age. Like, we can't fine-tune this. Just raise the age. Let them get through early puberty. Raise the age to 16. Some people say 18, but I'd say, if we can get 16, I think. But there is also the one bill that might make it through Congress this year is called KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. And it has all kinds of restrictions in it that say all the stuff you're doing to adults, some of that stuff you can't do to kids. You have to default them to be private, not reachable by strange men anywhere in the world. So there's a bunch of protections that we can give, and those would help. They're not going to be game changers necessarily, but they would make it a little less toxic. They'd make so there is a lot we can do. Once again, this is an area where the companies have shown they will not do anything that will reduce their user base or their profits. So I think we will require government help to reduce the harmful externalities that they're producing for children.
John has an excellent section in the book about the design choices and some of the things they've done in Europe that could translate here. I will add, Meta came here and gave a presentation about, and when asked about just this question, the design choices, couldn't you alter the platforms in these simple ways? They said, that's up to the parents. We give parents this little button they could, right. So their answer is, it's none of this is our responsibility, even though we designed it.
Even when you have two married parents with PhDs working on this really hard, they generally can't do it. And so what's going to happen for single moms who have no time to supervise and no resources to buy, so the argument that, it's up to parents. This is one of the, and I think they're pushing this out through libertarian circles also. No, there are, not everything is, like, can they go gambling and go to strip clubs and go to bars? We can't expect those places to check IDs. It's up to the parents if they want their kids to be drinking in bars.
That's good. All right, let's see. I saw there's a hand here. Oh, okay. Oh, you get next.
You had a wonderful discussion in the book. I mean, one of the things I appreciated very much about the book is you were not afraid at times to say, no, this is not just correlation versus causality. This is causality. Yeah. This is the reason this is happening, and I really appreciated that. I'm interested to know what is the correlation and perhaps the causality between and you talked a little bit about this in the book, but the addictive, the way in which these organizations use this algorithm to garner addiction, to garner the dopamine hit, not every time, but maybe every fifth time or maybe every seventh time. One, is there a correlation between that and just the absolutely insane amount of addiction, like actual opioid addiction, fentanyl addiction, that seems to be just ripping through people this age, just ripping through them? And would you make any different statements about giving a smartphone to a recovering addict?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say, don't focus too much on the algorithms. Algorithms matter, but I think not as much as people think. For example, Twitter didn't even use algorithms until 2017. It was just straight chronological feed. Video games aren't using algorithms. A lot of the addictive things aren't using algorithms. So focus more on the dopamine than the algorithms, I would say. And if you have something which gives reliable, quick hits of dopamine to children, you are going to change their developing brain. I think it's permanent. I think there's lasting marks, but even leaving that aside, there's no doubt that you're changing their brain in the short to medium term. Because when you take it away, they go through withdrawal cravings. Anna Lemke has a book called Dopamine. This is just like, it's the same withdrawal cravings as you see with other drugs. So focus on the dopamine. And then I just heard, so this area of addiction is not my expertise, but I did hear someone saying recently that especially once you've gone through puberty like this and your brain has been warped by the easy dopamine and you have to have it, that you are more subject to chemical addictions then. You don't have the ability, so one of the key terms here is executive function, which develops in the frontal cortex in mid to late puberty. The ability to set a goal, garner the means to get there and stay on task. That's very hard to do. But by the time you're an adult, most of us are able to do that much better than when we were 12. So yes, I do think, I can't prove this because it's not my expertise, but I do think that if you have a kid, a girl who's always swiping on social media, a boy who's always on multiplayer video games, it is going to change the dopamine neurons in their brain such that they would be more subject to addiction. I believe that's true, but I don't have the sites to prove that one.
Okay, so I want to take that a step further. So all of us who are involved in the discovery of education technology over the last 30 years, and in 2012 there was such a breakthrough. I mean, we thought this combination of project-based learning combined with online, executive function, self-driven learning. I mean, I've been in all the rooms with Rick Hess and many others. Well, we thought this was the holy grail to really helping children discover great moments in learning. And so talk about the intersection of this and where are we going then, because this is massive and it failed largely because we didn't have the right system set up during COVID. But the world is China is structured this way, India is structured this way. America is not really turning back, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what we do about
He's got
it.
a slide.
Yep, I have a slide for that.
Great.
It's a great question.
So in theory, in theory, all the technology was going to help. It doesn't look that way. It looks like it's hurting. In the 90s, we had what we called the digital divide, which is kids from high SES families all have computers and poor kids don't. We have to get everyone a computer. It's an equity issue. Everyone needs their own computer or tablet or laptop or whatever it was. And won't it be great if they have it with them during the day, during the school, they can use it for all sorts of things. Didn't anybody realize that if they can text from their device, they will be texting all day long? And that's what seems to be happening. These devices, while they have some benefits in theory, in practice, they're texting devices, and the boys watch porn, they play video games. I mean, the distraction effect of these it so vastly outweighs any beneficial effect that it literally shows up in global data. Here we go. So Derek Thompson had this a couple months ago. After the latest PISA numbers came out. So PISA, as some of you know, the program for international whatever. It's the international assessment of actual academic progress. The kids take tests. And so the scores were pretty stable in the 2000s. And then what happens? Yes, they go down at the end during COVID, but the decline started after 2012. And then let's look at the best data we have in the United States, the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as the Nation's Report Card. This is quite remarkable that we made steady progress in reading and math. Our kids were literally getting smarter or better educated from the 70s all the way up to 2012. Then what happens? It turns around. Yes, it dropped during COVID, but notice the drop started in 2012. So ever since we brought all the technology into class, our kids are getting dumber, distracted, our teachers are quitting because they can't stand it. Our education system is a complete mess because of all this free technology that the tech companies are giving us to try to get kids onto their system. I didn't say this in the book because I didn't have time to do enough research, but I believe what we need to do is rip it all out. Just get rid of it all. The teachers, of course, let them have a computer. There should be a screen. There can be computers in the classroom that they use sometimes. But the personal technology, a thing in your hand that you take home with you, that you can customize, get rid of it all. The Waldorf schools, the people who created the technology, they don't let their kids have it. They send them to schools that don't have technology because they know what these things do to kids. So I need to do the research. That'll be the next project. But I suspect that the answer is get rid of all of it, the personal tech that you have with you.
No, back row there.
Thank you for coming. It's been a wonderful talk. You've alluded to the attention economy and the impact of attention, but I did notice early on in your presentation that ADHD numbers did not seem to go up at the same rate as depression and anxiety. Can you speak a little bit to that difference and then what that difference, the impact of that difference on the solutions? Because you seem to be talking a lot about increasing attention, and how does that, what's the correlation between attention and depression and anxiety?
Thank you for that. I didn't spend a lot of time studying ADHD because from early on, the links between social media and depression and anxiety were those were the places I was focusing. That's where the debate was, and those are the clearest links. And at first I thought it was mostly a girl's story. But as Zach and I worked and tried to figure out what was going on with the boys, we saw there was video games, porn, there's all sorts of things happening with boys, not necessarily from social media. What I report in the book, because I was interested in the question of like, with all this move onto these devices, shouldn't ADHD be going up? And I didn't find evidence that it is causing ADHD. But I did find evidence that if you have ADHD, it makes the symptoms worse. So kids with ADHD, they love this stuff, and it just fragments them further. But I can't say that it is causing a rise in ADHD. And what we saw in that slide I showed you was a gradual increase, which is consistent with just over-prescribing or I don't know if that's the case, but I'm just saying we don't see a hockey stick. With anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide, we see hockey stick graphs. So that's why I focused there.
Far back corner over here.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question relates broadly to the phone-based childhood, and I'm curious, in your view, what the sort of partial effect of the actual content and structure of social media sites play in influencing these mental health declines we've been discussing. And then on the other hand, the effect of just substituting out in-person interaction. So in other words, is it the technology itself, or is it just the fact that we're no longer interacting face-to-face?
Well, I'm sorry, when you say did you mean, is it the content, like the things kids are watching? Is that what matters? Was that your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
Would you say that it's the social media content or the structure of
Or
these
the
social media
opportunity
sites?
cost, yeah.
Right. So in general, I'm not that interested in content. In general, I side with Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman. The medium is the message. Those Senate hearings we saw in January, it was all about why is there so much self-harm and suicide content? Can't we cut that out? And the tech company, they say, but Senator, we spend $7 billion a year removing 93 trillion pieces of self-harm content. Like, no, even if you could get 95%, which you can't, but even if you could get 95%, you still have kids spending 5 hours a day, every day. That's the average. That's the American average. 5 hours a day, every day on social media, which includes TikTok and YouTube. So I'm not that focused on the particular content. I'm much more focused on the time and the opportunity cost. But I'm recently coming to see that there's something very special about short-form video, which is really, really bad. So try this experiment at home. I do this with my class at NYU. Say, how many of you, let's try it right now. Okay, how many of you in this class, how many of you in this room watch Netflix at least once a week? Raise your hand high for Netflix. Okay, just those of you. How many of you wish Netflix was never invented? The world would be better if it was never invented. Raise your hand high. Okay, one. Okay. Now, how many of you in this room watch TikTok at least once a week? Raise your hand high if you watch TikTok.
Be honest. Be honest.
Oh. Wow, very few. Let's see, once again, there actually is data. Progressives watch more social media than conservatives. Okay, but so just those, okay, raise your hand again for TikTok. Or Instagram Shorts, Instagram Reels.
Oh, right, it's the
YouTube
Reels.
Shorts.
It's all
yeah.
the Reels.
Okay, if you watch any of the three, any of the short form, raise your hand high. Raise your, okay. Just those of you. How many of you think the world would be better if it was never invented? You'd rather it was never invented. Most of you. That's what. So the point is, here we have. This is. I hope if there are any economists listening, sometimes people say, well, willingness to pay. Like, how much would we have to pay you? There was a study done at the University of Chicago by Leonardo Burstin last year. How much would we have to pay you to not use Instagram for a month or TikTok? And people have to be paid because they don't want to be kicked off. But then you say, well, what if we could get everybody off? Then how much would we have to pay you to join them? And then it becomes, oh, I would pay you so much money to have that happen because people feel trapped. What I'm coming to learn is that stories are good, movies are good, television shows are generally good, and they're a lot better than, when you and I were kids, they were stupid. They were really vapid, right? So, television is actually better now than it used to be. It's the short form ones that they're the ones that they're not real stories, they're just little dopamine things. So I would really urge you, if you're going to let your kids have some social media, just make sure they don't do TikTok and other things. I mean, maybe a little bit, 30 minutes on the weekends just so they can see some things that others, but the TikTok habit or the short, those I think are really bad.
All right, we've got time for one more question. In the far back over there.
Hi, thanks for giving this talk. So one thing I don't hear talked about as much, as my understanding is a lot of the studies that find, self-reported negative effects of social media on mental health also find at least some people saying that there's a self-reported net positive effect. And there's plenty of people in DC who would say something like Twitter has been great for, promoting their work, networking, that kind of thing. I was kind of wondering how should we think of that, or is there a subset of people who are, using social media in a fully responsible net positive way? Is it wrong to do like a blanket ban on this kind of thing? We know even with like a lot of vices that there's some small portion that are very likely to get addicted, but some portion who would never get addicted and like never have a propensity to misuse.
Sure.
So how should we think about that?
Yeah. So once again, adults versus children. These tools are very useful. I use Twitter for various purposes. If adults choose to use one of these tools to advance their needs, which includes all kinds of networking and information gathering, that's great. I don't think that 6th and 7th graders have much of a need to network with strangers or to, find information which they are free to do with Google. So all the talk about the benefits, it's vanishingly thin. Because you don't find that the kids who are doing it more are happier. You don't find that it actually increases happiness. All you find is that when you ask them, does using this, how do you feel when you use this? And Mark Zuckerberg is correct that in that internal study, most of the variables were positive. Like people say, it makes me feel closer to my friends, it makes me feel connected. That's true. These benefits are vanishingly thin because they're not nearly as good as what they replaced. So what if we took every kid and said, how about if you never see your friends again? You sit alone in a room. Oh, but we're going to give you the ability to like each other's posts. Now how do you feel? Oh, I love it. I love liking I love seeing their posts. So what happened to girls when they went on, in 2012 is when they largely moved on to Instagram, they became much lonelier. That's also around the period when boys moved on to these immersive multiplayer games. You can't go over to your friend's house anymore. You have to be alone. When boys were connected by these incredibly exciting, amazing games, they got much lonelier. So I don't believe these reports, or rather I do believe, but all these reports are saying is that the kids themselves see some benefits, but if you ask them, as I just did here, if you ask them, would you rather that Instagram or TikTok was never invented, they say yes. If we could all get out, we would. So it's a trap. And the way to get out of collective action traps, there are a couple of ways, but government regulation, especially when companies are harming children, that's a pretty effective way to escape from the worst of these traps.
I will remind everyone that there are some books, and I think you're willing to sign a few. Do not hold them up because there's a lovely reception also just outside this door if you'd like to talk to Dr. Haidt. We also
about 10 minutes over there, and then we'll go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then a reminder that May 7th we'll have the lecture with Ruth Weiss and Matthew Continetti. But please, everyone, join me in thanking Dr. Haidt.